Charles, over to you. I don't know if this thing is working.
I think so. Good morning, comrades. Morning to the comrades who are joining us online. Is it fine if I sit? I have young legs, but the way they get tired is unbelievable. So there are several factors that have contributed to the skyrocketing increases that we have witnessed in food prices. Now, as we know that our food is currently globalized, so it's very much impacted by what happens in other countries. For example, it's impacted by what happens in the countries that are producing seeds. It's impacted by what's happening in the countries that are producing fertilizers, and so on and so forth. So we saw the COVID-19 pandemic introduced several disruptions. There were disruptions in production, there were disruptions in processing, there were disruptions in retail. The entire food value chain was disrupted. So that has had the fundamental impact on our food system, contributing to the increase in food prices. We also know that the war in Ukraine is having an impact on our food prices as well. And the cost of fertilizers from 2021 has gone up by 300%. So you can imagine how much that is for the ordinary farmers. Now, the thing is, most of our soil is classified as what can be called junky soil. The continuous use of fertilizers, of agrochemicals, has over the years destroyed living soil organisms. So you find that a lot of these large-scale farms, they are dependent on fertilizers because the soils have become junky soils that need these chemical inputs in order to produce food. So when the price of fertilizers goes up by 300%, it has quite a negative impact on farmers, the costs and so on and so forth. And also know that the global is in a process of stagflation. Food inflation has always been higher than the general inflation. For example, food inflation stands at 6.7%, meanwhile the general inflation stands at 5.7%. Another impact, of course, are the continuing climate shocks that Professor was talking about. And we've seen, for example, in Brazil and Argentina, both countries produce about 14% of the world's meals, and they were impacted by droughts. So when those droughts impact all of these maize-producing countries, there's a huge impact on our global food system. And in fact, in several countries, we're beginning to see signs of what Professor Satka has been calling climate famines. We are seeing famines caused by climate impacts and caused by climate shocks. And we are seeing this around the world, and of course, as Prof was saying, we are witnessing here even in South Africa. But another issue that is impacting food prices that is not generally talked about in the media is the issue of biofuels. Now, biofuels are a false solution. They're not a solution to the climate crisis at all. Now, unfortunately, the Biden administration has been supporting the large-scale import of grain in order to support biofuel development or biofuel production. Now, biofuels are categorically opposed to food sovereignty, and that is why we've always rejected them because they are a false solution. Another issue that has impacted our food prices globally is that China's pork industry has been recovering from the swine flu. So there have been large-scale imports of grain in order to feed the 15 million or so pigs that they have over there. So that drives up the prices of crops, impacting the global food system. Now, in a South African context, we have seen the food basket month to month increasing by 2.3%. Now, this is from the Peter Maritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group, and they do excellent work on this. But year on year, we've been seeing a 10.2% increase in food prices. Now, what this means, let's take, for example, the impact it is having on children. Now, in South Africa, you have 12.7 million children who rely on social grant. Now, the social grant is only 480 rands. Meanwhile, the average nutrition diet for a child will cost about 828 rands. The food poverty line stands at 663. So what this means, as Prof has been saying, that the responses of the South African state are insufficient because the child support grant is actually 28% below the food poverty line. It's 42% below the average nutritious diet for a child. Now, in South Africa, you have over close to 50% of households being women-led. So you have a lot of mothers who have to sacrifice their own dinner in order to feed their children. So the food price increases are entrenching patriarchal norms. We are seeing, it's a patriarchal poverty, to put it in other words. So it's having quite a deleterious impact on the people, and the mitigation factor, the mitigation measures by the state are completely insufficient, which is why we've continually been calling for the implementation of a universal basic income grant to meet this. Because the current measures are insufficient, they are entrenching poverty, and they are taking the country backward. I mean, if we have 12.7 million children who cannot have a nutritious diet, what does that mean for their development? What does that mean for the future of the Republic as well? So it's entrenching the same racialized development that we saw in apartheid. It's basically apartheid by other means. And the ANC state has drastically failed to deal with that. So even though we are not highly reliant on the importation of food because we are regarded as a net food producer, but the fact of the matter is because our agricultural system is so deeply globalized, whatever happens in the world will impact us as well. As we are seeing, for example, with the prices of cooking oil. We are net producers in that department, but because the prices of cooking oil have been going up around the world, the response of the South African capitalists is to do the very same thing as though we are dependent on imports, even though we are not. So our deeply globalized food system, which is not catered for the majority of our people, is completely failing. And it's leading to skyrocketing food prices, and the mitigation measures of the state are not enough, which is why, of course, we have been championing food sovereignty alternatives like Jane Cherry will be talking about. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Can you pass it on to Shanaaz?
Hi everybody, I'm going to stand. I'm Shanaaz Viljoen from Children's Resource Center. We are a national children's movement, and we spread in the 4 regions of South Africa, and we have a presence in about 30 communities where we have youth and children's community groups. I just want to brief you on the right of children to food campaign that Children's Resource Center is leading. I'm not actually a speaker, but I'm going to read stuff that we've put together. Hungry for mass-based salvation, and not just hunger and malnutrition has become a feature of life for many impoverished kids. They need solutions for the long term that go beyond charity. Therefore, Children's Resource Center took the lead, and we have launched this campaign in April 2022. There is many people that came up on board, but I just want to share a few things that happened on the grassroots level that has got so much challenges for us to deliver what we were planning to do. We have an integrated children's community project because since 2017, when funds were very low, we had to consolidate quite a few things into one thing and decentralize it so that we don't have the huge cost of transport. So during COVID, we had to add feeding programs to this integrated projects, and feeding was never part of what we actually delivered. And there was a funder, community development, who gave us a donation of 2,500, and we added 2,500 to that, and we delivered the first feeding programs throughout South Africa, spread in 16 areas, and then it was posted on Facebook. And then due to that post, a Swiss person came on board and he offered us a 35,000 to continue with that feeding programs. But what I said to him at the time, our staff was already retrenched and they all served as volunteers. So I suggested, can we use 20,000 for the community and 15,000 for the staff? Because they also need to put food on their tables. What is the use? You feed the community and you don't have anything to eat. So then we delivered 84 programs, feeding about 100 to 200 people in each of the 16 areas. So it came to actually more than 16,000. Then the other challenge we had was in January. It was the city had a call for humanitarian relief, and there was such a huge process you had to go through. Besides the registering, you are registered as an NPO and as a PBO. Then you had to register as a Western Cape supplier. You had to register as a city supplier. Then as a national treasury. And when all that was finally done, this was now just to feed your community. Then you had to do a COA, which is called a Certificate of Acceptability. Then they came out as inspectors to come and inspect your kitchens. And even that was a problem because at one community house, there was like a cigarette butt in an ashtray, so they rejected that. Then at another house, there was a little egg of a cockroach, so they declined that. But they don't understand that the people who's doing all this type of stuff, they come from local areas, they're poor people, and they still commit themselves to do all this type of stuff, even though they are not getting paid to do that. Then finally, the city approved us. We were approved in 11 wards, and for each ward, they approved 129,000. So if there were more than one organization in that ward, that 129 had to be split into the 3 or 4 organizations in that ward. But unfortunately, it came to actually who you know and not what you're doing. So we were just approved for the 3 areas in Khayelitsha, and all the other areas got nothing. So after that was delivered, the feeding program actually just ended there, and we couldn't actually continue with that. And then CRC participated in a 6-year-long class action against the bread price, fixing by a cartel compromising Pioneer Foods, Tiger Brands, and Premier Foods. It eventually resulted in an out-of-court settlement that came to 3.5 million, and that money had to go back into the communities, out of which Children Resource Center got 250,000 rand. So with that money, we, the 16 kitchens we have, we actually provided them with pots and stoves, and we equipped them to run effectively. And then also we did some feeding programs, and when that was finished, that ended there. And then I want to share the situation we have in Port Elizabeth, Bettelsdorp, Rimfasma. There was 3 food gardens that was established there that was going very well, besides the others we already have. But now due to the water problem they have, that 3 gardens is not down the drain, but it's not the way it used to be. So that is also another challenge. And then whatever we do, programs, you know, children they come from their homes and they never had anything to eat. So we need to see that we have food for them, whether it's bread, coffee, or water. But even that becomes a challenge because you do not have the funding to cover all that. And then social development, 3 times declined because our children didn't fit the service basket. So so therefore, as per, I'm just going to go through the article that was done through New Frame, where they interviewed Marcus Solomon, and I'm just going to share what was discussed there. The Children, the Resource Center, as I said, the national movement in Cape Town, based social movement for children, has invited all organizations of the people to form a broad-based social movement to launch a long-term program of action to save South Africa's children from the slow violence of malnutrition. Our kids are in a terrible state, said Marcus Solomon. Malnutrition is slow violence and stunted children are unable to learn. The whole idea of this campaign is to get mass support for the rights of children to food, a basic grant income, a whole environment. We are asking as many people from every aspect of life to join us in this campaign that we are now busy with. The latest available figures from the University of Cape Town Children's Institute from 2020 indicated that about 4 million children in South Africa had stunted growth because of malnutrition and another 10 million went hungry every day. The new campaign aims to use the organizing successes of the past to amplify the agency of children. This is not a webinar campaign. The basis is the mothers and children in the streets, ensuring accountability. The campaign hopes that a constitutional court case will result in government departments being prosecuted whenever a child dies of malnutrition on the grounds that the government is not fulfilling its constitutional mandate to put in place interventions to eliminate hunger among children. I'm not done yet. There must be justice for these children and their families, and the government must be held accountable. Post-school education and training at Nelson Mandela University said we don't even know if the families get any support when children die of hunger. The campaign believes that the profit-driven food industry, with its penchant for increasing food prices and its oversupply of non-nutritious processed foods to impoverish communities, is part of the malnutrition problem. And it says the threat of climate change further creates the need to overhaul the way food is produced, sold, and distributed. It plans to link the estimated 1,000 of local community food gardens that exist across the country and work with grassroots organizations to set up more such projects that government, business, and public must support. We actually had quite a few community dialogues with network partners in Mitchell's Plain and in all the other areas on a way forward on the Rights of Food campaign. And then the other aims of the campaign are to secure a basic income grant for adults, an increase in child support grant, and the right to work for adults. Marcus says, feeding initiatives like these, many of which were started by working class people during the COVID-19 lockdowns, cannot continue to rely on goodwill and a charity response. Without a coordinated national response, children are paying with their lives. We cannot continue to be passive victims of violence, of poverty, gender-based violence, and more. The creed that says children are the future is meaningless. They cannot have a future unless they have it now. Thank you.
I have Jane Cherry from the Food Sovereignty Campaign space.
Thank you. Can we go?
Okay, hello everybody. I'm going to be sharing about food sovereignty alternatives that the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign has been promoting before COVID, but particularly pathways and strategies that we have tried to deepen and strengthen during COVID. And this is essentially in response to the food crisis, the hunger crisis affecting children, but also that Charles has spoken about. So first, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with SAFC because that is where the CJCM originated, but just for those of you who are joining online, maybe who aren't aware, I'm just going to give a very brief background to the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign. Here we go. So it was launched in 2015. There were over 60 organizations present at this launch, and they're representing people in the social justice, environmental justice space organizations, and also farmers. It's a national platform to raise awareness about hunger, the crisis of the crisis-ridden corporate food system, and people's solutions. From 2017, the SAFC decided to promote food sovereignty pathways in villages, communities, towns, and cities. So it was still doing a lot of national level work, but we really wanted to focus on building pathways locally to show that another food system is possible. And then just to mention COPAC, who is based in Joburg, we also decided to set up a food sovereignty hub in Wits. So I'll share some of those pictures later. But this hub essentially has a food garden, a communal kitchen, a farmer's market, food culture space for hungry students. And we encouraged and tried to support others to set up many similar hubs and demonstration sites. Some already existed. Some of you here have farms and hubs. But we really wanted to try and promote that and learn from each other and share lessons. And this was all prior to COVID. And then COVID hit, and many of our partners couldn't visit our farms. Some were too afraid to venture out initially. Some used the moment to feed their communities because there was a lot of hunger and starvation. And some also used the moment to set up community and household food gardens. And we saw a lot of those popping up during COVID. But in terms of our food sovereignty approach during COVID, we tried to continue with our local pathways, trying to support them. We initiated a few new interventions. But COVID also gave us a bit of breathing space to deepen and strengthen our food sovereignty thinking and our pathways and our strategy and approach. We also tried to engage some farmers and funders. First, we realized that we needed immediate food relief. As an organization, COPAC specifically, we didn't go out and feed the hungry, but there were lots of organizations who were doing that, so we decided to map that. And this is the map of food relief initiatives during COVID. If you zoom in, there were many. So this is a really great map, and we learned what people were doing, brought them into the SAFC space. Second, we offered training. And this was an 8-part online agroecology series with John and Zira, and we were oversubscribed for the first one. We had to increase our Zoom package just because people were really interested in setting up their own food gardens. And these are all online, so anyone can access them. And then the third thing we did was we tried to map food commons initiatives. There are 28. If you zoom in, there's a lot more initiatives there, but we really wanted to see where the alternative food system was being built or grown. And so that's the third thing that we did during COVID. And then at the same time, we took a step back and we developed a longer term strategy. We realized there are going to be more shocks. Francois has highlighted how it's going to affect our food system. there's going to be more shocks like COVID, there's going to be climate shocks, and we need to be prepared. And so next slide. We developed a food sovereignty hub approach. This is building on all the lessons prior to COVID, of all the practices that are on the ground. But we decided that we are going to try and build and strengthen food sovereignty hubs and pathways. So through the National Food Crisis Forum that we set up during COVID, we actually engaged the Solidarity Fund, and we presented our proposal to them. They weren't really thinking long-term like us, so they didn't give us funding. But we really are trying to find funding to fund these hubs, and I'll show you in the next slide just the kind of impact that these hubs can have. So based on our research and calculations, if each hub, so we want to set up 1,000 hubs, if each hub supports 1,000 farmers, who each on average supports or feeds 10 people, we can feed 10 million people. And that's quite a lot of people. So this is our food sovereignty approach, and this is how we're trying to bypass the corporate food system. It's also important to mention, and I'm sure all of you know, that food sovereignty pathways are an important climate justice charter movement alternative, systemic alternative, since the food system is heavily locked into carbon, and it makes so much more sense to transition to food sovereignty. And in this slide, you can see from a document that BioWatch released earlier in the year. The industrialized food system creates 1/3 of all human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. So food sovereignty pathways are climate justice pathways, and we need to change the way that we live, the systems we live with, and a very important part of that is how we grow food and eat. And an important part of that is creating localized food sovereignty pathways based on agroecology. These pathways have the potential to tackle the cost of living crisis, but also reduce carbon emissions and the destruction of ecosystems by pesticides. And there's our food sovereignty, feed ourselves through food sovereignty alternative in the charter. And then here are just some examples of the WITS food sovereignty side. I'm not sure who's making the so here you can see students are saving seeds at the university. The second picture there is our recent workshop that we hosted at WITS during the year, setting up our second food sovereignty hub. And there's some food growing on the right. And then bottom left is a beautiful mural at our first food sovereignty hub, where we got a Bolivian muralist to paint. We really want to make it a food culture, a space for dignity for students. And so that's why we brought in the art as well. And then on the bottom right is another food garden that we set up at one of the residences at WITS. And then finally, just to mention, during COVID, there was a lot that was going on. A lot of you were feeding your community, setting up more gardens, and we wanted to document that. So we did a bit of research, Charles led in that process, and we put it all together in an activist tool, which we'll be launching a little bit later in the year. So keep an eye out for that. Thanks.
Thank you, Deedat. Awande?
Sorry, I just got kicked off the Zoom.
Jane, is Hameda online?
Yes, Hameda is here.
Who's online?
Four is online.
Rosheda's here.
Rosheda's here.
And there's something called Goyo Bikisha online, no? From South Africa.
So I'm speaking about UBIG, with Universal Basic Income Grant, connecting the thread of this panel on the cost of living crisis. And just for some who might not be aware, in terms of the context, the the Universal Basic Income Grant is trying to deal with the serious challenge of inequality in South Africa, which is arguably our country's biggest problem, because you see the inequality in everything. And this is particularly a sore point because of our failure to deal with this inequality post-1994, something that we've known about and is something that comes from our past of apartheid and colonialism. But when we speak about inequality, a lot of the times inequality is spoken about from the point of income inequality, how much people are being paid, which is important. But in the South African context, we don't speak much about the wealth inequality and the need for wealth redistribution, because the wealth inequality is the clearest sign of how this inequality was generated and how some within our society have been able to accumulate resources to the detriment of others. So it's led to most of people in our country not being able to live a life of full dignity. And I think that over the past 2 years with the pandemic, that became more and more clear for those who had not seen yet, but if you have eyes, you would see what the society is structurally dealing with. And then when you add to that the high unemployment rates and the levels of poverty in the country, this crisis just is a snowballing effect that is continuing to grow. And when you take into consideration global warming and the challenge to a low to no carbon economy, the issue of inequality becomes worse and worse, and it's something that we cannot turn away from. So this is where the Universal Basic Income Grant comes in, or the idea of the UBIG. And the concept of BIG is different from the normal grants. Grants are means tested, meaning that there's a laundry list of things that you have to, you must fit before you qualify to get a grant. And there's a lot of different political and philosophical questions around why we have grants the way that we have them, and why we don't pay people a UBIG or a Universal Basic Income Grant. Why we don't see it as necessary that everyone deserves at some level some assurance with regards to their ability to be able to find a way of surviving in the society. And that's what a UBIG guarantees. In the South African context, the question of UBIG is something that the conversation began post-94 with the Taylor Committee in the 2000s, early 2000s, and also through the support of then Minister of Social Development, Zola Sweya, and the report that was released in 2002 following the Taylor Committee, which supported the implementation of a BIG in South Africa. And there are a lot of examples around the world where this policy has been implemented and to be tested out, and it has also shown its effects and its potential in minimizing and limiting inequality. Some countries like Finland, Quebec in Canada, Namibia, our neighbor, and Spain are examples where it has been tested, and it's shown that when it's not means tested and when it's universal, it works the best. So through the work of the hashtag UBIGNow campaign, and with the help of some progressive academics and economists, we had some work done, some calculations on how a UBIG could be implemented in South Africa and what the most transformative version of a UBIG would look like and how that would help with the issues we're speaking about now with regards to poverty and the cost of living crisis. So the first version of it would be an unemployment grant. So that's for people who are not in school and who are not receiving any other grants but are unemployed. And this follows the Stats SA's definition of broadly unemployed, was called again, which was 32.6% last year, and around 46.3% around June last year. These are some of the figures that are given for the unemployment at the time. And the Stats SA's food poverty line amount, these are 2021 figures, of 614 Rand. So giving everyone that amount, you can see a decrease in poverty levels of 38.5%. At the lower bound of poverty line, you give everyone 882 you see minus 43.5% reduction in poverty. Then at the upper bounded poverty line, these are 2021 numbers, 1,331 Rand, you would see a minus 50.7% reduction in poverty levels in this country. And then obviously you would adjust these figures by 5% annually, and also we keep all kind grants intact. So this is what the government could do now. These are figures that I'm giving of what is possible with the amount of money that our government has, and with our population or how many people would require this grant. This is what can be done right now. And then the other version is an adult big, so giving everyone from the ages of 18 to 59 a grant with the other grants that people are getting. So it doesn't mean that we give you this grant, we remove the other grants, those stay intact. And you can see here the figures also at the 614 figure, minus 55.2% reduction, second figure, minus 66.5% reduction, and at the third figure, minus 84.6% reduction. So you can see that the more people we give, the greater the impact of this big is on society, on poverty, on inequality, and on our economy. And then obviously with the universal basic income grant, with all the other grants staying intact, except for the child support grant, you would see the lowest figures of 52.5% reduction in poverty, then a 73.3% reduction, and at the maximum number, 100% reduction in poverty. So this is an example of something that we can put in place as a democratic systemic reform, which helps deal with the structural issue of inequality in this country. So with regards to how these amounts were calculated, we also worked with economist Asghar Adilzadeh and his team at the Applied Development Research Solutions. And they also showed that with the implementation of a UBIG specifically, you can see between 1 and 2 trillion rands collected by the state through taxes and wealth redistribution programs. So it also help generate money for our country to do other things that we need. So the UBIG has also been a very important aspect of the charter in terms of the alternatives put in place with regards to how we see society in the transition. It's very important also in the context of a deep, just transition to have something like the UBIG, because workers and communities who rely on carbon and fossil fuel-based economic activities also need some kind of financial and economic safety net to kind of catch workers and communities to help them in the transition, help people while they're reskilling, help communities who have survived off the livelihood that comes from mines and coal-fired power stations and things of that nature. And without something such as a UBIG, we can't have that. So that's also important in the context of the climate crisis. If inequality is something you don't care about, but you care about the climate crisis, then you have to take this seriously also. Thank you.
So comrades, the multifaceted crisis of socio-ecological reproduction is being challenged by climate justice charter movement forces. The charter calls for us feeding ourselves through food sovereignty. And many activists stepped up to do that in practice during COVID-19. And many activists are still doing that right now in the midst of the deepening crisis. And there's potential for us to scale up food sovereignty to feed this country, to have a zero hunger country. Imagine if we have 3,000 hubs, food sovereignty hubs across the country, basically feeding over 30 million people. We'll be extremely climate resilient and we will attack this hunger problem head on. Imagine if we have the universal basic income. I mean, according to the modeling we did and so on, and we entered the public debate together with Black Sash, IEJ, etc., we could end poverty in this country, starting at the lowest bounded poverty line and incrementally increasing it. Within 5 years, there can be no poverty in this country. But as Awande says, it can also help us deal with the just transition. So in short, comrades, there are alternatives that will reinforce the right to food for children and for the rest of society. Now we've invited partners and of course allies in progressive civil society to also give us a sense of how they understand the crisis that's unfolding. We've invited SAFTU, but unfortunately, Comrade Ruth Intlakotse, the president of SAFTU, who I've been in contact with, sends her apologies and she couldn't make it today. She has an urgent commitment in Tshwane. But Hameda Deedat from Naledi is online, so we'll hand over to her for a 5-minute input.
Morning, comrades, and thank you very much for the opportunity to make some comments on such a substantively important topic. Can you hear me, Vish?
Unmute.
I have unmuted. Can you hear me, Vish? Hi, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Hi, Vish, can you hear me? Hello? Vish, can you hear me?
Hameda, I can hear you, but I'm not sure if anyone else can hear you.
Yeah, I'm not sure why people can't. I see Vish looks... Do you know what the problem would be? You want me to...
Let's see. Comrades, can you hear me?
It seems like those of us who are on the on Zoom can hear you, but the people in the hall can't hear you, seems like.
Okay, then let me put my video on and wave to them to say, comrades, you need to. No. Fish, can you hear? I'm going to have to just call, comrades, I'm going to just call Jane, so give me a second because I'm also sitting offline. I mean, online.
Great, thanks.
Hi. Okay. Hameda, they actually can hear us, but we can't hear them responding. So they said to just give them 5 minutes before you do your presentation.
No worries. Perfect. Thank you so much, Viljoen.
Okay. Thanks.
You want me to test? Can you hear me now, Vish?
Thank you.
Great stuff. Okay, so good morning to everybody. My name is Hameda, as Comrade Vish introduced me. And let me just say thank you very, very much for giving me the opportunity to make a contribution on such an important topic. I think first and foremost, just to say, so I'm the research arm of COSATU. I don't have a mandated position, but I think Awande's presentation really was a very good inlag to the comments that I want to make. I think the first thing, if we just go back to 2020 and we look at the issues of COVID, one of the key challenges that came up when one looked at an issue of an epidemic in the health sector or pandemic of that nature, one had to then link that to the issues of how does one's body respond to that, noting the context of malnutrition. The fact that government continuously was asking people, you had to stay at home, you had to put on masks, you had to sanitize, it assumed certain things. You had to be able to buy sanitizers, you need to buy masks, you need to have the home that you were in had to be well maintained in terms of the number of people that one would assume would be living in that house under a lockdown situation. Was quite bourgeois in its orientation, really dislocated from what was happening and what is our reality from a poverty perspective in the context of South Africa. I think secondly, what COVID also showed is when government finally recognized that there was, and I think through civil society pressure, that poverty and the amount of people that were actually suffering from starvation in the context of COVID when they decided to do food parcels. If you look at if you just go back to the queues, the number of people that were lined up at the spaces for food parcels was in some way was horrific, because we couldn't, while many of us working in the space would have had some clue or idea of, the levels of starvation and food insecurity that was starting to emerge in our country, to vividly see that on TV. And recognize that even the number of parcels that government was handing out was not commensurate. I think when we saw the issues in KZN, the uprising, the issues in Gauteng, government constantly, spoke to it around vandalism and an unruly class. But people, by and large, were stealing food. Right? The media might have focused on televisions or radios or whatever, but 90.9% of the time, people were stealing food. And rather than responding to the fact that we have a pandemic, and that this is endemic for our society currently in relation to food insecurity, government responded punitively. In KZN, I think for many months subsequently, they've had the army basically trying to keep political stability and peace in the area. If you look at the issues of the truck drivers, so while there was an element of xenophobia, it was food trucks that were by and large being stopped. It was food that was being stolen. And you'll see, through social media, lots and lots of footage where when a truck was capsized and there was food, you had hundreds and thousands of people running towards the truck, taking the food. So, I think why this is such an important discussion, Bish, is that we do not seem to get to have not us, I should rather say government somehow is delusional. It's like an ostrich with its sand in the head, refusing to recognize how its macroeconomic policies of austerity is worsening the conditions for the poor and the working class in particular on the ground. I think if I go back to the comrade who spoke from the Children's Rights Center or the Reading Center, we would never, even if you go into our apartheid history, and I'm not in any way wanting to, give brownie points to apartheid, but I think even the apartheid government knew that you had to have a schooling feeding system. We never suffered from malnutrition or kwashiorkor in our history. Yet in our current situation, you've got children who are going to school who are malnourished and are suffering with kwashiorkor. And the worst part is when children do not have access to food at such an early level, the implications both physiologically as well as mentally sets them back years. So all we're doing is perpetuating the inequalities that we've tried to come out from, or what we were aspiring to address as we moved into our new democracy. And now almost 30 years into it, we're actually worsening the situation. So I think just, another key point, and I think, again, Awande raised the issue in relation to workers and the working class. We know that by and large, it's the poor that bear the brunt. And I think the first speaker did a brilliant analysis in relation to the fact that because we believe we live in a global world, capitalists are very quick to pass on unnecessary costs onto consumers or onto workers and onto the poor, but they don't translate the benefits. So when the rand to the dollar exchange is actually in favor of the rand and things actually become cheaper, things don't become cheaper for us. But when things become expensive or supposedly become expensive because of an externality beyond us, they're quite quick to increase the cost of food. And we've seen eggs, which used to be a basic staple, go up to close to 70, 80, even 90 or 100 rands. The same with potatoes. And if you want to cite the research of the Economic Justice Unit in Pietermaritzburg, what's so phenomenal is when they did, and they consistently do the research, when they did the research juxtaposing the food basket to the national minimum wage, despite, and I say this coming from labor, despite our inroads in relation to achieving the national minimum wage, if you want to actually have every single household eating properly with minimal nutritional value, or the minimum needs being met, you need 8,000 rand. And we know that the national minimum wage falls far short of that. We know that workers that are within the informal economy fall far short of that. And we know that when you look at the poverty line, people are eating less than living on less than $1 a day. So I think it's absolutely imperative And I really want to commend all the partners that are in the room that are taking forward this issue. I think from a labor perspective, we really need to escalate the urgency and actually indicate how much food insecurity has actually become a pandemic in South Africa. Thanks very much. I know you gave me 5 minutes, so forgive me if I went over. Thank you, Vish, and thanks, comrades.
Thank you, Paul Marden from Solidarity, the union. Paul, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Vish. Yes, good morning, everybody. Thank you for the feedback. Thank you for the opportunity. It's really wonderful for me to be able to participate. I think the facts speak for itself in South Africa. We are in a deep economic crisis. Most of the speakers this morning referred to the crisis, but it's a crisis on about every level of our social and economic existence. With the recent rises that we had in the repo rate, and in view of the various uncertain and uncontrollable factors, such as labor instability, climate change, international and internal political volatility, one cannot help to be concerned about the threat of a spiraling or runaway inflation. And of course, everybody gets affected by these crises, but it's primarily a working class issue. It's an issue of justice and equality, as workers and poor people are suffering the brunt thereof. It not only threatens and disrupts food sovereignty that we heard about already this morning, but even worse, it also threatens and disrupts water sovereignty, specifically of the working classes. And the interplay between water and food sovereignty is extremely important. It inputs negatively on each other all the way. Children, and we've heard about that as well, especially Charles and Shanaaz referred to that. Children are even more affected than adults, as malnutrition could result in stunting of physical and mental development, and even more so the children who are socially and economically disadvantaged. So in South Africa, we really need, there's various aspects that we need, but important, we need an economic growth that provides good and sustainable jobs to all. Of course, the energy crisis must be solved. Of course, we need to address the climate crisis. Of course, labor-intensive industries must be established and developed, and public-funded employment, such as the Public Works Program, must be expanded, although it must be properly managed as well. Link this up with support to enable the livelihoods of workers, including programs to support unemployment or the unemployed and poor people with education. And I think this is the crux as well, that support must always be given to support people with education, skills development, and startup financing, the financing to start businesses, etc. And I think the food sovereignty hubs could also be linked in here. Personally, I'm not in favor of grants for this purpose. Rather, boost the economy and enable people, give skills to people. I think the current social relief distress in all its various facets keep people alive, but barely. And in itself, it does not necessarily assist people to raise above their circumstances to a sustainable future. It's imperative that we link the social relief distress to factors such as job seeking, skills development, etc. Awande gave a very good presentation to us on the universal basic income guarantee, but I think it is beyond South Africa's means at this stage. Yes, a universal basic income grant would be the ideal situation, but I don't think it's practical in South Africa. It's not practical in our current economic situation. It cannot just be mahala. It's not possible. At this stage, what I think is necessary is a basic income guarantee or grant. It may be universal or not, but it must be subject to conditions. It must be conditional. And here I think the means test has a role to play because it just does not make sense. There's a lot to be said about the economical inequality in South Africa, but it does not make sense to give a basic grant to everybody, even the people who are the richest, and that will only be at the cost of the poor. So, yeah, I think those conditions are necessary. Active job seeking should always be a part of the social grants. Achieving grade 12, at least, undergoing skills development programs, etc. Those things must be provided for. And of course, the caregivers grants should be subject to similar conditions. The funding of the basic income grant is a big question. It must be fair and equitable without unduly burdening positive contributors to the economy. But there's a lot of options that could be considered. The lowering of income tax-free threshold will create a wider income tax net. The increase of VAT while expanding the list of zero-rated items for basic foodstuffs, or keeping VAT unchanged but removing some of the zero-rated items. And more preferably, in my mind, without increasing the national budget by reallocating, the national budget, we must reallocate funds on the national budget to the basic income grant, while maybe suspending or terminating selected government programs and restructuring and right-sizing the civil service. Just one thing that I want to say on the sideline, we've been looking at the cost of living crisis from the perspective of our realities in South Africa, our economy, and the climate crisis. But there's another looming crisis that has not hit us really yet in South Africa, but that we need to consider, and that is the impact of the fourth industrial revolution. It's possible and even probable that progress with the 4IR would decrease the value of human labor, and it would lead to the phasing out of jobs. I know we as organized labor don't want to hear it, but I think it's inevitable to some extent, even to a great extent. This situation would be in contrast to the current social relief systems that we have, which requires from individuals to work or at least actively seek work. When human work is made economically redundant, while intelligent machines become more productive and cost-effective, a basic income grant, at least for those people who became redundant, should be considered. It would be appealing. But I think this is a matter for future discussion as well. It's for later on. Lastly, I know I'm over my time. I apologize for that. Role of organized labor, broadly speaking, organized labor, purpose of unions is to pursue the satisfying of the needs of its members at the workplace, of workers. And in South Africa, trade unions were instrumental in effecting political and social change through strong militant action. And a fundamental facet of the Labour Relations Act is the collective powers of unions against the power of employers. And at least until there is a sufficient maturity with employers as well as organized labor, this strong arm approach would remain very relevant and necessary. But I think we must also take cognizance of changes in elsewhere in the modern world, where successful unions have become professional service providers. They don't necessarily enter into battle with employers and demonize them as the enemy. They are proponents of partnership with employers in the achievement of members' needs and desires. Their purpose then becomes to assist their members to grow their personal wealth by negotiating profit and share participation plans with their employers, and even shared ownership of business, I want to hazard to say. They focus on the contributing on the growth of the economic cake and to negotiating a fair share for their members. So I think in South Africa, trade unions, as well as maybe globally, we should at least start by burying our inter-union hatchet and set our differences aside to engage in open and courageous conversations, to find common values and objectives, such as, and there's a lot of them, such as climate change and addressing the economic crisis and all its catastrophic consequences in South Africa. So let us work together in a united front to demand and to ensure action by government and business to take our members to a sustainable future, not only in the strategically influencing of policy, but also in accelerating change in our country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, and your interventions are very welcome, and they add to the debate that we need to have. And I'm sure there's going to be some important debate that follows. Over to you, Rosheda.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, climate justice and the consequences of global warming upon the informal economies and informal settlements. The insatiable greed for profit at any cost, selfishness, and imperialism, utter disdain for the sustainability of the planet and its inhabitants continue to break down and destroy Earth's natural vanguards against pollution of our oceans, skies, and lands. Every moment it continues is a moment lost forever. One wonders if we have indeed not crossed the Rubicon. The UN conferences have solved very little, if anything. COP25 in Spain and 26 in Scotland produced disappointing outcomes. One has to ask if the elitists who are temporarily in charge really have the will and or desire to significantly reduce their carbon emissions. From our perspective, it certainly does not seem to be so. Yet, their arrogance is blatantly projected, even in the face of unnatural climatic disasters occurring more frequently in their own countries. With COP27 approaching, one wonders whether any tangible outcomes could be expected. Would these Neros continue to fiddle with the earth is being systematically destroyed? Will Egypt offer up anything spectacular, anything positive, anything at all? The earth cries out for relief. She cannot be allowed to suffer anymore. The global South and East Asia are worst affected, and the carnage continues. Unseasonal rains, floods, heat waves, drought, and other unnatural weather phenomena have wrought havoc. Starvation is the order of the day. The richest countries in the world who have the opportunity to assist use their wealth on producing instruments of war, which they continuously propagate for further profits, regardless of the consequences. I'm Rosheda Muller, and I'm the president of the Informal Economy of South Africa, the IEDF. The IEDF covers various organizations. It is an umbrella of the informal sector. We represent organizations such as the informal trade, street traders, the home-based workers, the waste pickers, Tumsa Union for musicians, Youth of South Africa, Satsau, the domestic workers, spaza shops, women in mines, informal tourist industries, and we serve as an umbrella for the informal economy. Many hundreds of thousands of our constituencies reside in informal settlements. Life is barely tolerable at its best of times for them. Skyrocketing prices on staple foods, flooding, fires impact their daily lives. And whilst we do not understand the consequences of climate change, similarly we recognize the greed of major food producers who pass an extra cost on consumers. That's us, so that their profits never diminish. Surely that cannot be just. The informal economy workers have no security of tenure. We are given a one-year lease to survive month to month on the streets. When it rains, we cannot work. When the wind blows too hard, we cannot work. Permits are an issue. Councils, municipalities, prasas of this world do not understand the need of communities to survive and for them to create the services so desperately needed by the informal sector. We have one inhabitable planet. Your Mars probes are a gigantic waste of money and resources. It is where even remotely possible for mankind to survive there. Your greed for resources would ultimately destroy that too. Capitalism and imperialism have benefited certain nations only, not unlike the industrialized West and some Asian countries. In my humble opinion, a truly socialist doctrine is the only one which would support climate justice, an ethos of care for one's fellow man, selflessness, and a belief in sustaining our planet for future generations is sorely needed. Our lives economically have become unsustainable. Deliberate global warming is akin to a crime against humanity, yet it prevails. They blame the global south as if we were responsible for our own socio-economic demise. The nerve they have. Where will the champions of climate justice be? Certainly not within the delegations of Sharm el-Sheikh, but at a fora like this today. We call, no, we don't call. We demand our government to do more. Rising prices on basic commodities are directly linked to global warming. Our people suffer the consequences thereof. To climate justice colleagues, I thank you for your passion and sacrifice. Professor Vish, you are my inspiration. Long may your advocacy continue.
Thank you, Comrade Rosheda. That was very powerful and very inspiring to all of us. Comrade Ayanda Kota from the Unemployed People's Movement, is he available?
He was having load shedding.
Oh.
So it seems like he couldn't connect.
Okay, fine. Comrades, we're now going to open up the floor for engagements. We have a little bit of time. Let me just see. Oh no, 11:45. Okay. Let's just take one round of comments and questions. Imran, your hands first. Chief, who else? Anybody else? Cool. Let's go.
Here's another one.
Yeah, good morning, comrades. I wanted to add to what Shanaaz was saying, because my organization is Finding Food. It's also part of the Children's Right to Food campaign. And one of the things that, from all the statistics that's missing, is children. And Comrade Marcus speaks about involving children directly in the debate that affects them directly. So one of the things that we're working on through Inspire Network, and we represent as part of our network also about 42 freedom schools, is to do a children's survey where we actually have a questionnaire for children whom we feed, so that we can have an indication from these children directly. How many times a week do they go and sleep hungry? How many meals do they have a day? And really getting a feel for how hunger and malnutrition impact the children themselves. And once we've got this information collected, we'll be able to give a voice to these children that suffer at the brunt of the crisis that we're all discussing here. But by giving them a voice, we'll also be able to highlight the need for us to really see the crime that we're committing against children in terms of, hunger and malnutrition. It is a crime against children, and similarly, the climate crisis and global warming and the earth our children inherit from us is a crime against them. We, our generation and the generation before us, through our negligence and through our greed, we've committed a crime and indebted our children and generations to come to suffer the consequences of our actions. And I think that must be the core of the climate justice charter, is that, the perpetuation of this crime against the future is the shame of our system and the failure of us to adopt systemic change that speaks to the common values that our forefathers and our common ancestry and our indigenous value system speaks to, and that we've neglected. And because of that neglect and the embracing of individual consumption, we have, and it's easy to point fingers, but we're all to blame. Each and every individual consumer is to blame for the condition we find ourselves, because of our consumption habits, because of how we eat, how we live, how we dress, where we stay, how we commute. Every aspect of our lives contribute to the disaster we are trying to address here. So it's a lifestyle choice and a lifestyle change and a lifestyle revolution that needs to happen. And it needs to happen in a way that we go back to the values, the indigenous values, that is still available to us, but which we refuse to acknowledge and accept in our own lifestyles, because we've become so capitalistic and so self-indulging. And these are values that we need to break and go back to our common values, because if those children can speak, they will tell you, you are denying me of my just right. Just as much as climate justice, we're speaking about the justice of the climate. We as a generation and the generations before us, we are perpetuating a crime against children and a crime against humanity by refusing to adapt our lifestyles to a way of life that's more sustainable.
Thank you, Imran. Thank you. Chief, we're just going to take these few hands. We're going to give the first panel a chance to respond, and we're going to wrap up. Yeah.
I think for me, the struggling reality is that we tend to divorce development from food security or food insecurity, but in actual fact, it is quite a paramount aspect of that. Because Paul mentioned the issue that when you offer people grants, we should also have the standard that at least they should reach grade 12. But then what we are forgetting is that 100% of the students come in and enroll, but eventually through their study years, they fall off, not because they are not able to cope with the studies, because they are hungry. So 95% of the kids fall off the education system because they can't afford to go to school being hungry. So therefore, it also retards our development. When we all voted in 1994, we were hoping for a just transition, which we have not got yet at this point. And now it's affecting the way we have a perspective on development, in the sense that we thought that our schools, because the people who came and became our government knew that we had been poverty-stricken all along. There weren't food systems from breakfast to lunch to supper in our schools. So we ensure that our kids go through a proper schooling system and eventually exit and go to higher education. I mean, that's had that, even at tertiary level, there are people who are still suffering from food insecurity. But they are thinking that kids at tertiary level, no, they should be able to proper meals. But because they were inadequately funded, then that system catches up with them. So we're hoping that at this point in time, what we want these conversations, we should not just have a conversation based on just climate change. It's a holistic approach to development in the sense. So we should ensure that that holistic approach, it goes to economic development, it goes to how our kids get education, because we at this point in time, we have a lot of people who have dropped out of schooling or have not been yet headmanship, and now we're going to force them to have skills which they basically can afford to understand. We're talking about 4IR now. As if 4IR is a solution to our problems. It's not. It's just a tool to development. So that's my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Umzile, Sunny, and then we have two people online, and we're going to just give the panelists a chance to make one comment.
Thank you very much for the chance. I want to first, I must thank you for the presentations. They are all wonderful. And I want to emphasize, Jane, that is, such information must be distributed because those inputs from those presentations are not documented, are not in document yet, but they have to be put in place so that we access them, because this information, if we leave it behind, it means we leave some tools that we can use to champion the battle. Anyway, I want to emphasize also that is this has to be a bit broader approach by using the tools, the information that we're already receiving, that we are looking forward to receive more as we proceed in the workshop. Hunger is an issue. Hunger, it's a big animal that we all have to put our minds, our energy into it. Because I believe that if we tackle the hunger, we can have at least a relief. But I believe in this collaboration, as I'm listening from the presentation, we are on the right track. It's just a matter of pushing one time, using the information and report back to the table as we are now. I cannot ignore the fact that I'm impressed with the spirit from the last presenter. I feel like if we have such spirit, for me, we have the energy, we have the power to manage it, to win the battle. So please, I just wanted to emphasize that all the information must be documented so that we have an access to the information, so that we apply the spirit using the information as it was and add on what it was already tabled. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bumzile, for that recommendation. We will put all the documents on a Google folder, Jane, or on the web page. We can decide, but we'll make it all accessible. Bumzile beat the ANC hand down in his ward, 85% of the vote.
Thank you. So I'm glad, Vish, that this is a safe space where we can air our point of view, and we won't obviously agree with everyone's views because this is a process, and I like the word that you use regularly, that we're building the pathways, right? So I'm not in agreement with some of the views around that we can't afford the UBIG, or that we must take personal responsibility for the climate crisis. Of course, we have some impact, but we must lay the blame squarely where it is, and that's at the doorstep of the global north for its extractivism, slavery, and for colonialism, and its part in the climate crisis. Of course, also, we must lay the blame squarely at the fossil fuel companies because they are driving this process. We have seen how they've ignored climate warnings for 30 to 40 years. It's almost like the smoking campaign, right? So the tobacco industry didn't support the idea that smoking leads to lung cancer, but obviously the science has proven that it does. So we must in all our interventions, be talking about where does the blame rightfully lie? Because you can't say to the people in Pakistan or the people in KwaZulu-Natal who lost their lives and tell their family members that they caused their own death. In Pakistan, it's now 30% underwater, but Pakistan causes 0.4% of global emissions. So we need to be aware of these issues. So I didn't, when I spoke earlier, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Sunny Morgan, I'm a climate justice activist, but I'm the global co-founder of a program called Debt for Climate and the South African convener of the program. And we want to do exactly that. We want to hold those responsible for the climate crisis and make them pay. So we want to do that in one way. We want to call for debt cancellation. We owe the World Bank and the IMF loads of money. In South Africa, the figure is just under 4 trillion rand. So it's 250 billion US dollars that we owe World Bank and IMF. And a bulk of that is for Eskom. So we want to call for that cancellation. And because we pay 192 billion rand in interest payments a year. So when somebody says we can't afford a basic income grant, well, I can give you 192 billion every year if we cancel the debt. Whose debt will we cancel? Because to make the connection of canceling the debt, it's a bit hard. But Eskom is in debt for just under 400 billion, right, of which 300 billion is owed to the World Bank for the loan for Modupi and Kusile. It was originally 5 billion US dollars. It's now just standing at 19 billion. So 19 times 18 to the dollar, we are around about that excessive amount. So that's how we will solve the problem at Eskom. We call for the cancellation of the debt. So comrades, we are here to show our solidarity, but that's the campaign that I support. And I'm here to show that we can pay for the food, we can alleviate hunger, we can keep the lights on if we cancel the debt.
Thank you, Sunny. Ladies and gentlemen. So, comrades, because of time, I'm just going to give the two online people a chance to speak, and I'm going to wrap it up with one or two comments. Paul and Karuna, yes, go ahead.
Thanks, Vish. I think while we're raising issues about the basic income grant, we need to also talk of an employment guarantee scheme because, you know, we really need to get the matching of supply and demand for skills in place. And more important, I think, is if we're talking about the just transition, it's about reskilling and reorienting people. Now, there are some things that we won in these 30 years, and one of it is free basic services. Given that we have an energy crisis, and the response currently is to move to gas, move to microgrids, and move to green hydrogen, we need to look at how free basic services can be protected. Of course, we also need to consider how we're going to tackle the SASL on their green hydrogen project because they're taking us down the capitalism path further. There's nothing radical about what they're doing. There's nothing transformative about what they're doing. Lastly, I think the big issue, and I didn't hear any of our panelists say it as crudely as I'm going to say it, our leaders are asleep in this country. There's many leaders in parliament, many leaders in all the legislatures and in all the municipalities. And they're totally asleep. They're not ethical. They're only looking at their own selfish interests and they're not guiding and taking the communities further, which leaves civil society to actually sit there and fight with them when we should be fighting jointly to really have a better future for everybody, for the generations in future, and to tackle the global north. And so what our leaders do is they go with begging bowls to the global north on all the multilateral engagements that we have, and buy into what China wants to do, what the US wants to do, and what Europe actually requires. Thank you.
Paul, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. No, mine's just a very short remark. I think her name, sorry if I have your name wrong, I think it's Rosheda, talked about the refer to the going to Mars. Made me think of an article in a science that I read the day before yesterday in a science magazine that left me feeling totally disgusted, and I want to share this with you, and apologize if I make you feel disgusted as well. They wrote about the amount of human, well, not human created waste that is found on Mars. Every time a spaceship or a thing that is sent to Mars, and it has happened now for a number of years, lands there, it leaves residue behind. It leaves rubbish behind, such as friction shields, etc., that breaks off the moment it lands or it crashes. There's been quite a number of crashes as well. So they said that there's a huge amount of waste that is lying on Mars. And then they end off saying that they regard this waste on Mars as a great human achievement that they could reach Mars. But it shows you the way in which they think. We're not even living on that planet, and we're already polluting it. But they regard that as a great achievement. That left me feeling very disgusted. Thank you. I thought I wanted to share that with you.
It's from Marcus Solomon.
Marcus, you may go ahead. Marcus, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hear you, Marcus. Go ahead.
Firstly, I want to thank everybody for this opportunity to share with you. And I want to once again say how well the Chartist Justice movement is moving to get people together. I want to thank my colleague Shanaaz for sharing our experience the last 6 months. But I want to add to what she's saying, what she said. In the last 6 months, we've worked with 18 organizations who've joined the campaign. And some of the things that the experience and lessons we've learned is that almost exclusively what is happening in communities, running soup kitchens, doing the gardens, fighting the gender-based violence, the violence and the poverty, are mothers and women, almost exclusively. What we've learned is that, and they are asking for a powerful, broad-based women's movement. The second thing, people are asking for a united front against all the terrible things happening. We've got 18 organizations, and we're also partnering now through this campaign with the Food Justice Coalition. And I think we're really going to appeal to all the participating organizations, especially, and I want to make a special appeal to the Chartist Justice movement to link up. In fact, what we've experienced is that all the organizations that have joined, they actually gather in strength by just focusing on what they are doing. And I think the Children's Resource Center is a founding member of the Chartist Justice movement, including the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign. We've learned so much, but I think through bringing children into the project, we've added value, I hope, and I know. Our children, and Imran has elaborated on that. The other thing is people are asking, demanding, calling, pleading for a peace movement. We need, mothers are saying we can't do anything without a peaceful and friendly, respectful environment. So it is quite important that we build a broad movement. For the main reason, the state has failed us. In fact, the climate justice movement is very strong on this. Let's build from the grassroots up. If the state is going to really collapse, there must be something in its place, and that's a broad movement. We've done it before, we can do it again. I've been very fortunate in working with people in the UDF and many different structures. It is only our people that can, a united people, and informed people that will take us through this crisis. In fact, scientists, the climate scientists, have clearly arrived at the conclusion. There's this need for a system change. How is it going to happen? In fact, we have now also realized through many years of struggle that we need a new approach. We can't just say class war, and I understand it very well. But we also need, especially when it comes to building a peace movement. Every day in this country, 70 people get killed. By whom? Amongst each other. 3 women get killed. So the desire for peace, we must listen to. And the desire for unity, we have to listen to. So I'm appealing from this campaign, and we made some wonderful responses already. The early childhood development programs, the South African Gymnastics Association, the People's Health Movement, and many others. That is my call, really, and our call, not my call. It's our call. Over the last 6 months, those are the messages we're getting, and we have to listen from our main teachers, our people. Thank you very much. Have you heard me? Hello? Oh my word.
We have heard you, but I think we can't hear them.
There are alternatives. And we have alternatives in the charter. We have alternatives that we are fighting for. Food sovereignty is one of those. The right to food for children is another. The universal basic income is another. The universal basic income, by the way, the modeling we've done can be deficit financed. Without deficit financing, sorry. We don't need to put the state in debt to have a universal basic income in South Africa. We've done the modeling. There's a virtuous multiplier effect, meaning the money will come back to the state through tax returns, etc. So even if you calibrate it at a modest, lower bounded poverty line, you will not require debt to pay for that. The economics is sound, it's clear, but the state is not listening. I think the second point that we must take away, comrades, is that we've got to converge the campaigns. This is a very, very important point. And I think, Marcus, your call is heeded. For us as COPAC, the entry point to the climate crisis is the living crisis of people. We're not elitist about our politics. That's why we started with the drought, we started with hunger, we started with water stress, etc. Let's continue that approach, comrades. The other point that's very stark in our conversation is the children and women bearing the brunt of this crisis. The charter says that women and children are the shock absorbers of the crisis that we are living through. So comrades, again, the point that was made by Imran, we've got to make sure if there's research that comes, etc., we put that into the center of our politics, into our struggles, etc. We make sure these children's lives are spotlighted, and we make sure that we communicate about this crisis. We are killing, literally, the next generation, comrades. That's what's happening here. Thank you. The final point, comrades, is that there is a crisis of leadership. There's a crisis of leadership politically, there's a crisis of leadership in the parties, there's a crisis of leadership in the state. But for me, the hope lies in all of you, comrades. We have amazing leaders here, grassroots activists working on the ground, pushing against these crises, advancing alternatives. Comrade Rosheda represents millions of informal sector workers. Okay. If we had Comrade Ruth here, she comes from a trade union federation, which is very close to us, that also is supportive of food sovereignty. They've adopted it as a policy approach. So millions of workers there as well. We've got Comrade Pumzile, for example, as I said, winning overwhelmingly against the ANC in his ward committee, beating them by 85% and so on. There's amazing leaders in our space, comrades. You are the future, comrades. So let's keep on building. Comrades, with that, we're ending this session. Thank you to everybody. Okay, I don't know what's happening next. Jane, is Ferial here?
Ferial had load shedding, so in 5 minutes she'll chair from there.
Oh, she'll chair from there. Okay, okay. Comrades, the next panel will start immediately. It's on the critique of the Presidential Climate Commission and overview of policy work. Let's get organized. We have Shakira Dawood, volunteer at COPAC, who will speak on the overview of the PCC critique. We have the CJ deal framework. Awande Buthelezi, please come to the fore. And I'll just give